Hello, this is Dennis Ojima, and we have quite a few people in the room, although some out of the room. We have the fortunate an opportunity to have Robin O'Malley sitting in with us today, and he's sort of doing a cross-country tour of science centers. And so
if you want the concert T-shirt, we'll
right. But in addition to Shannon and Robin, we have Jeff Morissette, Brian Miller, Stacy Lynn, and Joe Lackett. Joe Lackett and Stacy Lynn are sort of two of our coordinators now at the North Central Climate Science Center. We have Tyler, what's your last name?
Beaton.
Beaton, thank you. And Colin Talbert just joined us. Joe Barsugli and Andy Hansen are here, the other two foundational science leads that we're working on, sort of updating ourselves on where we are and looking at our next proposal. So that's sort of who we have. Additional members of the team coming in as well. So today we have the opportunity to start looking at some of the social ecological work that we're doing on drought, and some of the method, sort of looking at some of the approaches that Shannon's been using in a couple of areas within our domain to look at sort of drought views among different managers in the Department of Interior. Land users. And this is sort of part of a larger effort as well that we're developing across the CSCs, working with a socio-ecological sort of working group, and they've been invited to sit in on the presentation, the webinar today, so that we'll have a follow-on discussion of sort of what other CSCs are doing on looking at sort of socio-ecological perspectives of drought and other extreme events, and seeing sort of how we can formulate a concept paper around these perspectives as we learn more about how our managers are dealing with things like drought or other extreme events within their climate science center. So Shannon's been doing quite a bit of work with interviews and surveys, mostly interviews, over the last year, and we have the opportunity to have her share some of the approaches and results, preliminary results from her discussions across within our domain. And I guess one last thought I will add before I turn things over to Shannon is that this issue of looking at drought, looking at sort of changes in aridity across the north central domain is a sort of working theme that is sort of we're using to coordinate research efforts, and our climate team led by Joe Barsugli, and then the vegetation impacts analysis, Andy Hansen for our science areas, and the adaptation and decision-making working group that Shannon and I are working on are using that sort of drought theme as a organizing theme for our research efforts. And so, yep.
Then it's just a question on procedure, especially since you have the carry-on across the cross-CSC thing, kind of scheduled kind of 12, 30 or beyond. We usually allow funded PIs to check in and have at least a little bit of 5, 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes to do that. Do you want to kind of check in before we do that in case the conversation just, I don't know, do you want to stop the dry presentation, go with the check-in, and back to the cross-CSC, or just, and our doors remain open to email and phone calls, but I don't know where you want to do that check-in.
Maybe we should do that first.
Yeah, why don't we do it for, take about, what, 5, 10 minutes first?
It might be nothing, but I'd open it up. So we've got Andy and Joe and Dennis, the foundational teams, and then Andy, and I don't see MSU other than Andy on your project. but we've got the Southwest and the surrogate species on the phone, so just, if there's anything on those projects to bring up that we should be aware of, now's your chance, I guess. We'll do that now.
Yeah. You want to start?
I mean, you don't have to record anything either. This isn't putting you on the spot. It's just to start. If we call it the monthly check-in to make sure that anything can get thrown out there if needed.
Jess, it's Karina here. Laurie and I were just wondering what the status of the latest solicitation was. We weren't sure whether or not it's gone out yet. If it has, we haven't seen it.
Excellent question. It's supposed to go out. It was supposed to go out yesterday. We're waiting for Matt Larson, who's in charge of the Climate and Land Use Program, to send an email as the official kickoff, and then we'll follow that up with our email list. And I'm kind of watching my email closely to see when that can go out, because as soon as Matt's done, then we'll send it out. So eminently, it's supposed to be yesterday. We're hoping today. Maybe Robin, I don't know if you've got any new news from headquarters.
I haven't seen it yet, but
good question, and thanks for the reminder on that. Yeah.
Sometime very soon.
Well, and I think a related question is, so we've got Abigail Lynch on the phone. Hi, Abby. Thanks for joining.
Yeah.
Have heard that there's going to be a national solicitation that comes out from headquarters that has a drought focus. Is there an update on that? Can you give us a status update?
Yeah, I can, or Robin can, because he's sitting there. But that drought solicitation will go out with the regional ones as well. And the focus of that one will be on the ecological impacts of drought and focusing on synthesis. So we're trying to kind of lay the groundwork for defining ecological drought on a national scale.
Okay, great. She said that the focus, and you can always go back. So we're having a hard time hearing people on the phone in the room. But anybody can, this is being recorded. We will have it available so anybody can go back and listen to any sections they didn't catch. But she basically said that there's going to be a solicitation with a focus on ecological drought and helping to define ecological drought. I didn't catch if there was a timeline on that.
So the solicitation that will come out is going to have like 8 appendices, one for each CSC state, I think the Northwest and maybe, and then a national. So look for the appendix that's the national drought theme. In the same announcement that'll come out today.
Okay, great.
That's the first time we've done this. So drought and migratory birds, and this question of what can you tell people about how to select and use downfield for protection are the areas where it's open to all CSC work and build into bigger national. That's the first one we're stuck with.
Could you guys on the phone hear Robin speaking just then, okay?
No. No.
Maybe.
He's
going to come closer to the phone and repeat that.
So I just said that this national solicitation on drought is the first time we've done a national one, and we've selected 3 substantive areas that we're going to build up national work that is above the level and integrates and draws from the work in individual CSCs. Drought is one, and as Abby said, we're going to focus on the ecological consequences and the ecological side. The human side has got a lot of folks in it already. Migratory birds is another area that's a big integrator and obviously draws together multiple CSCs, so it's got and there's obviously a strong partner base for working on those issues. And then the third one is, and I believe Steve Gray, our Alaska CSC, has been given the task of writing the same kind of concept paper that you're talking about here. The third one is guidance to people about selecting using downscale or other projections, climate projections, and can we make some progress on helping people through that tough choice in the beginning of the ecological model and effect side.
Thanks, Robin.
Anyone on the phone want to report in on their Nope. Okay, if not, maybe we'll.
I'll just say really briefly, like our time study, that we've been making a lot of progress in basically habitat suitability modeling white mark under future scenarios. A paper that's just about done on that.
And then Kathy Whitlock is making really good progress on the paleoecology analysis of white bark, asking under what conditions should it by a watershed past 14,000 meters. And then additionally, we met with the Greater Yellowstone Coordinating each of the supervisors, National Forests and National Park Superintendents around Yellowstone, reported all of our progress and asked them for feedback on how to shape the products to be most useful for them. And there was a lot of interest, particularly from the Forest Service, in that effort, and a lot of guidance as to how to prepare emerging climate vulnerability in Region 1.
Thanks. And I'll report that with the surrogate species project, Helen so far is arranged and kind of pushed us to have a mini workshop next Monday on evapotranspiration issues in the Plains and Prairie Pothole region. We're probably leaving the higher elevation stuff aside for this mini workshop. If anyone's interested in joining that, let us know. We've got a WebEx set up. You can send a note to me, and I'll make sure you get that information. Or if you're working directly with Helen, you can check with her. And Joe Garsugli and Andrea Ray are going to be there, and it's going to be a real ecological response model-driven discussion on ET, and it'll happen next Monday from 9 to 12, I believe.
I can give you...
Stay there. I got it.
This is Joe Garsugli. I can give you the very brief agenda. Is we're going to have Mike Hobbins from the National Integrated Drought Information System talking about ways to measure and parameterize evapotranspiration based on climate variables. We're going to have Ben Livna, who's a hydrologic modeler, talking about the role of land surface models in estimating potential evapotranspiration and evapotranspiration. And I'm going to talk a little bit at the end about how to configure, more generally, how to configure your data to do climate projections, how it's done, a couple of methods, a couple of general methodologies that are used. So this is building on conversations that Helen and I and Andrea Ray and Richard Seeger at Lamont have been having to help her project along. So it's a sort of a 3-hour quick mini workshop.
I mean, with the option of maybe a high elevation workshop, you know, in a later time. I think they got some deadlines that the Susan Goggin, Barry Noon's project, and Helen need to push forward to get it done. So we did it quick in a mini workshop, but there might be subsequent workshops on ET and higher elevation because that's the main thrust of the, or one of the main thrusts of what Joe and his soon-to-be hired postdoc will have.
I can give a little update from the Southwest. I have just finished, or I'm not finished. I'm still have a few more interviews to go, but I've done probably, I think about just over 30 interviews down here in the San Juans with primarily agency folks. We did them first, and I'm now just starting to interview grazing permittees in this area. My brain is still stuck in the middle of what, like the 1,000 different things that people have told me, but in general, the interviews have been fascinating and yielding some really interesting insights into how managers think about uncertainty and deal with uncertainty in their decision-making. And then as is starting to emerge from the ranching interviews that there's possibly some potential issues there around different levels of certainty required to accept particular actions. So I'm off from May, but I'll be back down here in June finishing up that interview set, and then we'll move into workshops which we're running with the agencies. And we've got the Forest Service one nailed down as having a focus on a grazing analysis, which they are currently in the process of doing, and so we will be helping them, or helping, I mean, the workshop will be focused on trying to think about how you could add a kind of climate adaptation consideration into the existing analysis which they are doing. And it looks like it will be attended by both grazing permittees and agency folks from the Dolores Ranger District. And the BLM workshop the date's been set, but the focus has not been defined yet. So things are going really well down here.
Yeah, 30 interviews, and you do plan to go back. You haven't run and you haven't quit. So.
Yeah, I mean, we've still got the Mountain Ute to go, and just working across 3 agencies on such diverse targets to try and get a hold of the kind of it's been a bit of a mammoth task, but it's been worth it because it's been, I mean, like I said, I'm finding out really, really fascinating things.
Well, thanks everyone for the report. It's good to check in. And again, email and doors and phones are open for issues and support you need from the center as you move forward. But I think we keep in touch, and so I hand it off for the highlight of this month's check-in.
Hey, Jeff, can I just give an update from Iowa State? This is Diane.
Sure. Oh,
just briefly, we have a manuscript that is in pretty good shape that summarizes the responses of 33 grasses and forbs to climate change in Midwestern grasslands. So I'm going to have my colleagues who are co-authors on this start to read over it, but it's in pretty good shape.
That might be a future monthly check-in topic. So
yeah, sure.
That, and we'll keep you probably in the queue if you're interested in that.
Sounds good. We need to schedule our summer ones.
Yeah, we just have it through June, so we're looking for slots after that. Okay, and as Dennis introduced, Shannon's going to talk about the DRAI project and concept.
All right. Thanks, everyone, for joining today. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to share some of the work that we've been doing on the drought topic, drought risk and adaptation in the interior standing for Department of Interior, but we also happen to be in the interior U.S. I have a little bit of a cold, so you might hear some sniffling and sucking on a lozenge, so bear with me. What I'm presenting here today is the very early phase of this analysis, and I just finished the initial phase of checking and coding transcripts earlier this month, and with 2 weeks of travel this month, only had about 1 week to start running some of the analyses. So this is going to be just a teaser after just that 1 week of analysis and some of those results, really basic, early results and possibilities for more analysis. And we hope to get lots of good feedback and questions from all of you, questions that you might be interested in terms of what we might ask of this data, so that we can turn this into a really collective and integrated process across our 3 foundational science areas. So this is really a kind of first exploratory phase and really trying to set up the methodology and the database, ideally for continuing to populate over time and throughout the North Central region. And of course my PowerPoint is not advancing. Sorry guys, let's try this another way. There we go. So I'm not going to spend any time today really on the conceptual or theoretical underpinnings, as we've done this in previous webinars that I and others have given, which are all recorded, and anyone can contact me directly if they'd like the links to go over any of those. And so this is really the only sort of conceptual diagram I'm going to show, which is our North Central Climate Science Center philosophy of the integration between our 3 foundational science areas: physical climate, ecological impacts and responses, and human adaptation and decision making. And really with the idea that this central sort of piece of the pie is where the management context and decisions happen. And this is really the kind of, looking at the manager's experiences, perceptions, and observations related to drought, which is the focus of this research to date, gathering information basically for these blue arrows, which are the management, the philosophy of, not only are we doing science to inform the management decisions, but we want to get knowledge and information and observations from the managers themselves to influence back into our science, so that we're really grounding our science in the context of Department of Interior management and decisions. So, of course, drought is a significant climate impact in our region. I don't have to really convince anybody probably on the call of that, but, you know, this really being the North Central domain, this is from August of 2012, and you can see, you know, we had a lot of very, very serious drought areas. And, you know, both the historical data and recent extremes along with climate change projections all point to drought being a continuing huge climate driver in the North Central region. And for the National Climate Assessment Great Plains report, one of our key findings was that climate change will ultimately result in increasing competition for water, which, again, is probably not a surprise to anyone here. So, as mentioned, we've done, you know, many other webinars on the sort of theoretical, conceptual underpinnings of this type of social ecological systems integrated research, including the previous one for this monthly check-in that Karina Wyborn gave on the Southwest Project, and several through the Adaptation Working Group. And so, really just I'm going to launch into, you know, what is the social ecological systems perspective of drought. So it includes a consideration of ecosystem livelihood connections in the semi-arid regions of the West, which in our region we have the Rocky Mountains to the Great Plains. Drought in the context drought context in the region is historically related to important grassland and mountain ecosystem services to society, and then connections to management and the interconnections between water management and livestock and wildlife forage, recreation and tourism, cities and rural areas, water for energy for both power generation and extraction and production, all of which occur in the context of Department of Interior management issues. And then including social changes along the mountain and plains interface that affect public lands and vice versa. So why the social ecological study on drought risk and responses in the Department of Interior context? Public land management is multi-jurisdictional, and there's a complex interplay between Department of Interior managers and their stakeholders. Conservation, energy, natural resource management objectives intersect across the North Central domain and public lands. And multi-scaled local to federal management and jurisdictional concerns and activities complicate both the impacts and the responses to drought. So as I mentioned, this is a really initial sort of exploratory phase, and the intent was to do a very broad brush look across the Department of Interior agencies and bureaus, tribes, and various sectors within those agencies and bureaus to identify some overarching issues and then to hone in on some of the hot spots and priority topics for the region. So some of the just kind of broad overarching questions are, how are the Department of Interior and tribal resource managers experiencing and dealing with drought? How do DRAI managers frame drought risk for the land and resources that they manage? How do the federal agencies work with each other and with state, local, and tribal entities on preparing for and responding to drought? And then what are the adaptive capacities federal agencies have to utilize to cope with drought in their system, and what might be some of the barriers to utilizing those capacities? So I had a set of 10 specific interview questions that I asked all of the managers I interviewed, and I won't go through the exact wording of all of those, but they basically focused on managers' drought definitions, risk perceptions, experience in their landscape with drought, and what management decisions drought affects. Drought indicators, in other words, what drought indicators they use to understand when drought is impacting their landscape and to what severity, the climate science that they use, impacts on livelihoods in the regions, and impacts on fish and wildlife in their landscape, and then, as I mentioned, adaptive capacity and barriers to respond to drought. And really, the purpose of this is to, as I said earlier, connect and ground our science within management issues to make useful, usable, and even actionable science, and really to understand how managers think about these issues, how they prioritize the issues, and their overall ability to deal with drought. So the target was managers who are out in the field offices, so they're actually out in the landscapes making those management decisions in the parks, in the refuges, on the reservations, the real on-the-ground decisions about natural resource management. So to date, I conducted interviews in 2 field sites, one in northwest Colorado and the other in southwest South Dakota, and I'll get into those a little bit more in a minute. I did 20 interviews across those 2 landscapes in the summer and fall of 2013. I had planned to do more, but they were scheduled when the federal shutdown happened in October, so unfortunately I wasn't able to do some of the additional interviews I'd planned on. So it goes. And the analysis is really a very empirical and systematic qualitative analysis with some quantitative aspects, and with the potential to combine more quantitative and geospatial analysis using Atlas TI, which I'll talk about in a minute, as I said, to identify these hotspots, key issues, decisions, issues of scales, indicators, so on. And the benefit of this type of interview approach is the ability to get much more in-depth and nuanced information than you can get from a survey. And so the trade-off is the loss of maybe statistical significance. However, statistical significance isn't always what you need. And in a case like this, when we're trying to understand the context of these on-the-ground complex systems that are extremely difficult to get from surveys, this can really be a precursor analysis to inform the development of future surveys, additional interviews, if we want to get some more statistically significant results around some particular set of questions. So the first place I did interviews was in northwest Colorado. Partly the reason was because this is an area I'd already been working in, and so I was working on water resource management in the context of climate change and drought issues as part of my postdoc at NCAR, the National Center for Atmospheric Research. So I already knew this landscape really well, knew the stakeholders really well, but the previous research was not focused as much on public lands. It was more on state and cross-sectoral water management issues. So this was really an opportunity to go back into that landscape and build on that prior research with a focus on public lands and resource management. So this landscape has a high proportion of federal lands between the mountain areas with a lot of U.S. Forest Service lands, a lot of BLM lands with ranching and oil and gas activities. You've got the National Park Service Dinosaur National Monument over here in the west. And then the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service manages a stretch of the Yampa River with 4 listed endangered species of native fish. So a lot of intersecting Department of Interior land and management activities on this landscape. The second landscape chosen was southwest South Dakota, also because of the predominant public lands in this region. Again, you've got a lot of Forest Service land here in the Black Hills and the Buffalo Gap National Grasslands, some BLM lands for ranching. You've got 2 Indian reservations, the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, which is this area here, and then the Rosebud Indian Reservation. And then some other interesting factors about this landscape is, one, the Wind Cave National Park, and then the national parks, of course, Wind Cave National Park, Badlands National Park, my mouse is not very responsive, sorry, Badlands, Wind Cave, and then you've got a couple of national monuments, Jewel Cave and Rushmore. And Wind Cave National Park has gone through the National Park Service Scenarios Workshop process, so one of the things we were interested to see is what kind of impacts that's had on management to date. And then another interesting thing that's happening in this landscape is the south unit of Badlands National Park is in negotiation to create the first national tribal park with the Pine Ridge Reservation. So again, and with that creation, they want to put 1,000 head of bison on that south unit. So again, a lot of interesting intersecting issues around public lands management, climate information, and policy, regulatory, and tribal issues. So the managers that I did get to interview, this gives you the breakdown. I interviewed 12 Department of Interior managers, 4 of which were BLM, 1 Fish and Wildlife Service, 8 were National Park Service, 4 tribal managers, 1 from NRCS in the Badlands region, and then 3 state water managers. And then the types of managers by position, I had 2 refuge managers or park superintendents, 4 ecologists, a fire coordinator, 4 rangeland management or technicians, 5 wildlife biologists or technicians, and 3 water managers. So the analysis includes, the first step is a little bit time-consuming and cumbersome because this involves getting the transcripts done, reviewing those transcripts for quality and correcting errors, and then I do a process of starting to code those interviews by hand before I put it into the software. So I'll get into what I mean by coding, but the time span for this initial analysis was from January 2013 to April of 2014. And granted, this was, only a little bit of my time here and there between all the other things I'm balancing, just like everybody. But just to give an idea of sort of how long this sort of initial process takes. And ideally, as this project moves forward, there's more of a team of people who can be helping with this. I've already enlisted some people here in the room to help with the future work on this. So the next step after the transcripts are all checked and hand-coded is doing the coding in Atlas TI. And Atlas TI, in general, is a software package that the researcher brings the theoretical and analytical sort of framework to, but in general it uses what's called grounded theory. Grounded theory is a methodological approach that employs a discovery process where data is used in an inductive way to identify categories, concepts, properties, and interrelationships within a data set. So this approach it starts in the research with the way the interview questions are worded, to how the data are organized and analyzed. And this avoids really injecting too much research biases into the data with preconceived notions. So it's very different than a sort of hypothesis-driven sort of top-down where you have a hypothesis you're testing, but rather you are developing your theoretical and analytical understanding from the data itself. So in this way, it allows for developing concepts, conceptual models, further hypotheses for testing, et cetera. So what Atlas TI does is it's a largely qualitative data analysis package that takes large amounts of textual, graphic, audio, video, geographic data, and so on to organize and analyze these complex data in a variety of ways. And in essence, it's a workbench for mapping contextual data to create meaning and to identify patterns and relationships within that data. So really, as I said, identifying these sort of analytic categories and themes and linking concepts into the relationships and theories about what that data is telling you. So coding is the process of taking chunks of narrative data and turning it into nominal variables that can be used to create various levels of classification and abstracting for theoretical and hypothesis building. So for example, when we talk about the concept of adaptive capacity for responding to drought, what are the various ways that managers respond to that? In an interview, what are the various types of capacities? How are those capacities related to climate drivers or ecosystem responses, and so on? So the coding process starts with this open coding where you start looking for these concepts in the data. The first round of open coding I did, I came up with 158 different codes, which is basically 158 variables looking at climate variables, ecosystem variables, and social variables. And then after you do that sort of first open coding phase, you do what I call code cleaning, which is really thinking about what codes you might be able to toss out, which ones you can combine, how to rename the codes, how to describe the codes, et cetera. So after I did that first round, I narrowed it down to 140 codes. And then once you've done that, you start looking at how are these variables related to each other. So that's when you do some of this relationship building between the codes. And creating of code families, so various code types. So like I said, climate variables, ecological variables, social variables. I've got a set of jurisdictional variables and so on. So this is just a screenshot of what the database looks like. And you can see on the right, any one set of narrative data is going to have multiple codes associated with it. And this is how you can then get into some of the analysis for looking at how these codes are interrelated within the database.
Question, so those codes are what's on the right-hand side? And do you define those, or just extract them from the text?
You extract them from the text. You know, grounded theory, there's a enormous literature on grounded theory and different approaches for grounded theory, and this kind of approach that I take is called more of a constructivist grounded theory, which is, you know, obviously I'm not coming to this research with a blank slate because I have a background in thinking about what kinds of different variables I'm looking for, but you're actually pulling it out from the text itself to define what those variables are based on the interviews. You could also have an approach where you have a set of variables predetermined and then you're looking for those variables. So it's a little bit of a combination of that because, of course, in the back of my head I have, you know, all the variables that I think I'm going to be looking for. But they are really derived from the data itself. So are there any other questions before I move forward?
Can you just give an example of that cleaning? You went from 156 to 140, I forget the numbers, but like, is it just sort of like, maybe an example, 2 get converged into 1 because one person said drought 2012, one said 2012 drought?
More complicated than that. I mean, that's a type of example, yeah. Sometimes it's things that, so when I get into some of the theory of grounded theory and how the groundedness, in other words, how much something shows up, if something only showed up once in the text and it's something that doesn't seem like it's going to be very important going forward, then I might get rid of that code. Or if 2 codes are, you know, you want your codes to all mean different things. So if 2 codes kind of are getting at the same concept or variable, you can merge those codes. So those are some of the examples.
But you go through every transcript and you mark every time climate variables comes up or a particular factor comes up?
That's right.
Okay.
Yep.
I wonder why it's so long.
Yeah.
All right.
Yep. It's time consuming. Anybody have any questions on the phone so far, or shall I move on? And Jill Lackett is monitoring the chat box on WebEx, so if anybody has a question they want to get in there for the discussion, or if you have a burning question, go ahead and type that in the chat box and Jill will let me know. So part of the step 2 of the coding is you've got documents and document families. So right now I have 19, they're called primary documents, and that represents 20 managers to date, and that's because 2 managers I interviewed at once, and it was, I've done multiple interviews in a couple cases, but in some cases it's easier to pull them apart and make them different documents, and some it's not. So the 19 documents represents the 20 different managers. And then organizing the family types by agency or organization, position type, or region. And so what this allows me to do is go between looking at generalized analyses where I'm looking at the whole data set, or if I want to look at just a subsection in a particular agency or tribes and maybe compare responses between one agency or another, then you can get at those sort of differentiality between different sets of managers within the database. So as I said, I really only had 1 week to start getting into the analysis. So what I thought I would start with is looking at code co-occurrence. And what co-occurrence tells you is it's a way to look at how topics or variables interrelate and the strength of those interrelationships. So I started with some topics that I thought would be maybe most useful or interesting for this webinar. So the first one is looking at managers' drought definitions. So the question was, how do you define or think about drought in the context of your landscape? And what that number 43 represents is in answer to that particular question, so in other words, the co-occurrence between the variable of drought definition and other codes, there were 43 distinct variables or concepts that managers talked about in relation to drought definition. So I pulled up just some of the top issues that they talked about. The number on the right is what's called groundedness. And the higher the groundedness, the more that concept comes up in the interviews. And so I just pulled, in this case, so out of the 43, I just pulled this subset of the top issues that came up. Not surprisingly, precipitation is the top variable that comes up. But after that are vegetation, climate variability, ranching and grazing, wildlife, bison, and so on. And these are still kind of at the broad sort of general level. What needs to happen next is some of these concepts need to be unpacked further to look at some of the typologies within these. So Jill and Dennis and I have already started talking about how to break out the vegetation variable to start looking at different land cover and land use types as an initial phase so that you can get into those more nuanced relationships of what topics are coming up. And then probably ranching, grazing, and wildlife will happen next. So just to give an example of some of the details of these drought definitions, so this manager is from BLM, and her answer was about, she thinks of it in terms of averages of rainfall over periods of times, or thinks about it in decades. So that one would be coded as climate variability. And then, and there's other ones too, but just to give one example of what that might, what a code might look like for that. So another manager from Fish and Wildlife Service talked about it, again, drought as normal, so again, climate variability, but talking about it in terms of fire danger, lightning, more severe lightning strikes, management of cottonwood groves, and their management strategies for enhancing vegetation through regeneration. So this manager from the National Park Service talked about their some of their mission or mandates for the, so this is from Wind Cave, of course, because she talked about the hydrology of the cave, so the relationship between drought at the surface and subsurface hydrology, and then management of some of their wildlife species, such as bison and antelope, and then indirectly through management of vegetation. So this is a typical answer where the way that managers define drought is directly related to their management responsibilities. So that's a really important thing to understand, because then you can think about how to tie in the types of science that we're doing to the way that they think about drought and the importance of drought in their management activities. So another co-occurrence I ran was on the question of what management decisions do you have to make that are affected by drought. And so the number again represents that 98 variables came up in relation to this question. So I took just the top 11 responses out of those 90, or variables out of those 97 variables with a groundedness of at least 10. So one of the things that I found really interesting is how high ranching and grazing scored in this analysis, because if you remember the manager types, I only actually interviewed 4 of the 20 who had some rangeland management responsibility. So what this indicates is that even outside of rangeland management, ranching and grazing issues are really important because of the multi-jurisdictional landscapes where parks and refuges butt up against ranch lands and private land management, and so they're really having to consider this relationship with ranching and grazing activities in their management for vegetation, wildlife, et cetera, because of those multi-jurisdictional landscapes. And again, keeping in mind that, you know, vegetation, of course, scored very high as well, and often the two are related because they're talking about maybe grasslands. But again, needing to further unpack that, the vegetation and the wildlife, to get at some of the nuances of what they're talking about. But at least you get an idea. And again, the private land and landowners scored high as well because of what I was just talking about, that interrelationship between managers of private and public lands in these multi-jurisdictional landscapes. So the next one that I ran for this webinar was, the question was, what if any indicators do you use to know if, when, or how drought is going to cause negative impacts in your landscape? So 71 codes were created from this question. And this one I took everything that had a groundedness of 5 or above. And again, a lot of the same issues are coming up, vegetation and precipitation, not surprisingly, at the top. one of the things I thought was interesting about this result was that local knowledge and observations are used as much, if not more, than climate science and information. So there's some really interesting interplays there. And again, we had this whole discussion this morning about this two-way information stream of science and local observations and indicators. So I think this is one that really shows the importance of that two-way information flow. So this was a risk perception question. Do you view drought as a significant risk to your management activities? This one came up with 89 distinct codes. So again, you know, vegetation issues, ranching, grazing at the top of this list. Fire and wildlife tied for top issues in terms of how managers think about drought risk. And it's interesting that climate change scored high, indicating that managers are in fact thinking about climate change and how that will impact drought risk, and that climate models and projections are influencing that, because climate projections are right below climate change, and then you've got climate science and information down at the bottom of this list as well. The 2012 drought scores high. It's very typical that the way managers, when they talk about drought risk and drought definitions and impacts and decisions, they frame it in their experience. And the most recent experience that they had, of course, was the big 2012 drought that was across our domain. And so a lot of how they think about it is what they saw during that 2012 drought. So to give an idea, again, of some of the details of how managers responded to this question of drought risk perceptions, this manager is a BLM rangeland manager who's talking about the fact that they have somewhere around 175 permittees out there, which means 175 different outlooks and 175 different ways of planning. And the managers talk a lot about how, you know, the old-timers tend to be quite adaptable and understand climate and drought impacts in their landscape. But the newbies, so to speak, the people that have moved in recently to the area are oftentimes the ones that they have the most difficulty with because they don't really understand the landscape as well. So he framed drought risk as the greatest risk is working with operators that don't see drought as a risk themselves and therefore don't plan for it. So this was ITBC is Intertribal Buffalo Council. So this person responded about drought risk perceptions in terms of impacts on bison, and particularly stocking rates and nutrition and feeding of the bison. This manager from the National Park Service talked about, this is a vegetation ecologist who talked about managing vegetation in the park and drought having a big impact on not just the quantity of vegetation, but because it's a mixed grass prairie, the distribution of that vegetation as well. And while most of the managers did talk about drought as being a big risk in their landscape, some of them, you know, were on the other side of the spectrum. This is someone from the Oglala Sioux Parks and Rec Authority who didn't think that drought is that big of a risk and talked about how they're pretty reactive in their responses to drought management, and overall for their grazing plans or management plans, they don't change that much. So several of the questions brought up issues of timing and seasonality. So timing of summer precip was in other words, rainfall. So I have different codes for snow and for rainfall. So in this database, precipitation represents rainfall. The timing of summer precipitation is the biggest issue, and presumably as it affects vegetation and grazing, followed by spring, then winter, then fall. And again, managers talked a lot about the context of the 2012 drought, impacts on wildfire, wildlife, and fish. And note that climate science information is ranked pretty high. So looking at in more detail at that relationship will be very interesting in future analysis. So that's just to give you some of the examples of the just very quick analyses that I did. Additional types of analyses and questions to ask of the data are starting to get into some more complex queries, asking the data questions about when interviewees talked about variables A, B, and C, or variables A, B, and C, and so on. Atlas TI can now handle geocoding with Google Earth, so actually connecting responses to places in the landscape. It would require more interviews because it depends on doing some statistical analysis, but doing code coefficient, which is looking again at the relationship between codes. So it's it's the code co-occurrence analysis that I did earlier, but then also looking at the reliability or the statistical relationship between those codes. And then looking at network relationships. And networks have a lot of different meanings. In Atlas TI, networks serve to visualize complex information in intuitively accessible graphical means. So you can create network graphs representing relationships between variables. The variables in the networks are called nodes, and the types of relationships between those variables called links. So, for example, something is associated with something else, something is the cause of, contradicts, is part of, etc. So here I created just a very simple network graphic on seasonality and timing issues. And the first number in each of these boxes, again, is that groundedness variable, so how many times that variable occurs in the database. And then the second variable is the what's called the density, and it represents the degree. So in other words, it means how much that variable is linked with other codes in the database. And these numbers will change as I get deeper into the analysis, but I just did some initial linking just to show you an example of this type of analysis. And then this is adding code co-occurrence to timing seasonality. So again, getting into deeper analysis of how these variables or concepts interrelate. And then this is just a quick one on policies, a typology of the types of policies managers talked about in relationship to drought. And when we get deeper into the analysis, the networks will be created that represent more of the structure and function of the systems that can be used to inform model or hypothesis creation. So some of the early insights from this initial coding and analyses is there's a lot of diversity in drought definitions and risk perceptions, and they're largely mission and management specific. Time and space scale specificity is key, but an area for more focused research like we were talking about earlier in our meeting today. For example, what scale of analysis is most useful or usable to managers, and how does that relate to these larger sort of regional scale analyses that a lot of us are doing? Adaptive capacities and barriers often have little to do with climate or climate science, which challenges the information deficit paradigm. However, opportunities do exist to provide targeted climate science and tools if and when at appropriate scales and tailored to specific management issues. And again, the more we can understand drought in the context of how managers frame and understand and think about drought, the closer we can get to taking our science from maybe useful or even potentially useless in some cases to usable and even actionable. So utility for climate adaptation, helping inform and shape actionable, what is now being called actionable science by linking science to management decisions. Identifying climate-sensitive decisions and decision calendars, again, at appropriate temporal and spatial scales for decisions. Identifying climate science needs and indicators. Informing climate history and possibly model storylines. And ultimately working toward climate-savvy decisions, climate change adaptation planning, and implementation. So the hope is that this database can grow by working with others to expand to other landscapes and or go deeper into the two landscapes where interviews have already been conducted. The more we can grow this database, the deeper our understanding of drought-related management issues throughout the North Central domain. And that is all. Thank you.
Thanks, Shannon. Questions, comments? So I guess one question I had in your coding, do you have a code for sort of the mission goals or objectives of the different managers that you interviewed? Because it seems to me that there's a distinction in there that there's a group of managers who have a sort of conservation goal relative to some of those, like BLM, we have more land use or grazing, goal. And have you coded that?
Yeah, it comes out in a couple different ways. Anytime remember that policy network that I showed? Anytime anybody talks about so a mission would qualify as a policy, so it would fall under that policy, and then depending on what in particular they're talking about, like I had that network that showed the various types of policies that they talked about so far, so threatened and endangered species, EIS, NEPA, so on. So that's where that comes out.
So there's no grazing policy in there?
So that is captured when you look at the interplay between policy and rangeland issues. So, and again, this is not complete. This is a draft. So you can get it by looking at the co-occurrence between policy and rangeland grazing. If they talked about a particular policy or management plan or whatever by name, then that would show up in there. But if they're just talking about it in general, then it would be in the co-occurrence.
Shannon, I have another question. So this is really interesting. This fits into what I would call the language we've been using is understanding the decision space and really trying to get into who we're trying to meet. And that seems to me to have what people are deciding as a first order, but the other two may be more important. Yeah, I have a big mouth, but maybe not big. Maybe sort of what people are deciding is a first order, but the integrator might be when they're deciding it, when do they actually need this, and what do they need? One of your slides said you got temporal information, but I was wondering, how far is this getting us to, did you ask about what information you'd need to make different kinds of decisions, or how is that pointing towards that? Do you?
Yeah, so there's a couple different ways that's in here through time scale. If they talked about a specific time or timing, so the timing, there's a time scale code, and then climate science and information. So that's one of the things that you can do is look at when do they talk about these things together, so you can get at some of those nuances. Yeah.
I guess something that's maybe related to the temporal issue, but a little bit different is I found it interesting that managers typically sort of frame their experience and risk in terms of specific events, so 2012 drought. So I'm wondering if either they talked about or you asked them about historical droughts or previous ones, and just to get a sense of how things have changed maybe over time a little bit.
Yeah, so I actually have one of my code families is drought years. You can see on the screen. So I captured any time they were talking about different drought years, it would get coded with that year. 2012 just happens to be the one, of course, that surfaced the most in groundedness because it had just happened, and like I said, that tends to be how people frame talking about impacts and risks and so on. But yeah, these are all the different time periods that people talked about. So this is another way you can get it, doing some historical analysis is by pulling out when people talked about and doing some of that geocoding, matching when people talked about certain years and certain impacts in landscapes, and then looking at what the historical climate data tells you about that. So those are some interesting kinds of analyses that you could do.
So it's getting close to noon. So maybe we should allow people to either have a last comment or sign off. And move into, I guess a more open discussion with the social ecological.
The cross CSD group.
Yeah. And anyone who wants to stay on can.
I don't know. Can you guys hear Dennis right now?
Yeah, just barely.
Yeah, just can you
So for this specific discussion, I guess we're going to wrap up. It's noon now, and thank everyone for participating. We do have this cross Climate Science Center group that is looking at social ecological system perspectives and looking at other extreme events. And so you're all welcome to stay on for this additional discussion. But if you need to sign off, that's great as well. And so we'll transition into sort of opening a discussion up for the next half hour, 45 minutes on this topic of looking at our socio-ecological system framing and how we like what Shannon has presented as a starting point for a sort of a concept paper or some other ideas of how or cross CSC effort.
Okay, thanks, Shannon.
Thanks, Bill. Hey, Bill, are you going to stay on? Or you're going
Yeah, I'm on.
Okay. So some of the issues that we've talked about, within our North Central is going to come back, sort of this issue of looking at risk analysis. And it seems to me that some of the methodology and some of the approaches in looking at drought risk would be an interesting case study to explore.
And another area that we've been following is this emergence on the web of aids for ranchers making decisions in drought. Sort of, it's a gambling and game theory approach, as well as a decision aid, decision support. It came out of Nebraska, partly out of the Drought Center there. And I think some of what Shannon just described, including, for instance, the herd management at Wind Cave, or maybe at Custer or Badlands, excuse me. They all have herds, I think, don't they? Wind Cave, Custer, and Badlands yes, bison herds in their case is raised in these systems, these decision support systems, and you can download the spreadsheet. And as a rancher, what you do is you put in the probability and price of feed and things like that, what you think your range will contribute. But you also have to identify what you think will happen next year in the drought, so you're thinking about the future. I'll send a link around that to everyone if you'd like to see it.
Oh, that'd be good. I guess another question for our cross-CSC group is, are there some methodological approaches building on some of the interviews that Shannon has put together that are there sort of a way of looking at this type of interview process, coding methodology to help, get a better handle on how managers are making their decisions? How do we characterize our managers in a way that ties back into climate change? So I guess opening up again to the cross CSCs, are those methodologies being used in your CSC, or is there something that we can do in way of developing a working group, a training, a training effort on looking at these approaches and building capacity and how we do this type of work?
Well, over in the Northeast Climate Science Center, although a lot of the work is not on droughts, in terms of flooding, there's a number of projects that I myself am involved in where we're using not only interviews like that, but also including some structured elements, including card sorting and other types of response mechanisms within the interviews that we also have the interviewees use talk out loud techniques in responding to, so that we can get some more structured comparable analysis across the interviewees, but we can also understand the depth and nuance that you get from open-ended techniques. So we'd be happy to talk about some of those methods.
So the card sorting is is that what we've often heard is called Q-sort?
Q-sort is one method within card sorting, and it's particularly used if you're going to use factor analysis on it. And it just depends on if you're planning to use that to develop a typology of different types of interviewees. I'm not using them for that. One of the things that we're trying to understand is when we're looking at adaptation, there's often discussions about how adaptation is also based on perceptions of adaptation efficacy and on the contextual situation in which an actor is making decisions. And so we're trying to understand what are the situational and contextual factors that influence decision-making processes and how those rank in terms of when people, and we're looking specifically in relationship to flood management, but how are those ranking in terms of the most influential in the decision process?
And you're actually physically with the interviewee sorting the cards?
We're physically with the interviewee sorting the cards, and they're going to pick out the cards that are most important from a list, and then there are some blank cards, so if they don't agree with them all, they can add them in. And then from those, while they're sorting them, we're having them explain to us the process of why they think that this is more important or why a different thing is more important in terms of their decision-making process. So there are definitely similarities with that and with the Q-sort method.
Well, this is Bill Travis. I'll just comment briefly. She couldn't be on the call. Katie Clifford, of course, was using learning from Shannon and structured her Gunnison interviews in a similar way, and just happened to use in vivo to do the textual analysis. But it's very similar to Atlas, and it probably almost. Do you think you can just open an in vivo file, a spreadsheet file, Shannon?
Yeah, there's ways to share between in vivo and Atlas TI.
And
I haven't done it yet, but I know that you can.
But and some of the coding looks really familiar. By the way, she's editing her thesis right now to be defended in a week and a half. Some of the coding looks familiar because she was following what you were doing and trying to use some similar ideas. She also had to try to be open as you were. She found the schedules to be really useful, the seasonal cycle or the calendar approach. And a couple of things that showed up were people worrying, identifying the possibility and worrying about the evolution of new types of seasonal periods. So, for instance, there's a small dry spell between the winter snow and summer precip. It doesn't really have a word in the Gunnison, but a few interviewees actually tried to identify it as the dry slot, and they were worried that it was getting bigger. So we were trying to be open to new things showing up in that cycle.
Interesting. And is this part of our thesis or part of the Southwest project or both?
The thesis.
Okay.
In this little dead space that we have, one of the things that is planned in June is a all CSE sort of working meeting. Part of the discussions are going to be on sort of what's emerging in way of ecological drought or just drought research. The other thing that we are going to be talking about are these sort of working group outcomes or sort of what progress these cross CSC efforts. And so I'll be sending out sort of a little query to you all about what are some of the key or highlights of social ecological system thinking in your CSE, what are the approaches, and I think as we think about how we might move forward as a group, thinking about do we want to have some sort of workshop where we look at some of these methodologies, what are some of the research questions that we're asking that might be where looking at those and looking at how we approach some of these research questions, are there lessons to be learned or shared across the CSEs of how we approach, how we actually start understanding this connection between the management decisions and some of the other research that we're doing within our CSEs. That meeting will be June 22nd to 24th I believe, in Minneapolis. Tuesday to Wednesday, Thursday.
I wonder to Joe, because...
So two questions that come to my mind when you see this, and I think it's really neat.
Maybe.
Yep. The grounded idea of, we always say we want to go at stakeholder needs, you want to start with the end user in mind, you want to start with management decisions, kind of like, and that's a little bit soft. And this really starts to get at quantifying it, or at least enumerating it. So what do you do next? In two questions, in two directions, is how does this inform like the foundational science areas of ecological impact? With climate scenarios, there's not a clear line to me between this and the other foundational areas that we're working with, although it's necessary. This is good. And then how do you roll it up to a national kind of issue on drought, or how does it feed into this? So I'm just kind of brainstorming, I think this is to be discovered, right? I think this is kind of part of what you guys are doing in the foundational areas over the next couple of years. It's an open discussion. That's why we had the half hour with Abby and the national drought question. So I just thought you guys could throw out initial thoughts on that. I'm curious to know that connection.
Yeah, I mean, some of the stuff that we talked about that's in here in terms of timing and the types of climate variables and ecological variables and so on, I think that they're getting more into the querying and the nuances of what the responses were. I think that they can really inform some of the work that's going on in terms of how you think about analyzing the data.
The climate data or the response?
Both. And presenting and communicating that data. To me, the way that that's going to be successful is if we have some mechanism to have regular conversations about it. Because I think as we get deeper into the analysis, if it's not an iterative conversation with Joe and Andy and others on the team, then we lose that opportunity for them to inform each other. So I think we just need to figure out a way to be having those kind of iterative discussions.
Could I display something?
Yeah.
Follow that point?
I think we might lose,
You need to give her a copy of that.
Or email.
Or email so that
it won't be online anymore.
Because you're still on WebEx, right?
Yeah.
But he's not.
Right.
And so he has to send you a copy so that you can project it on your desktop.
Is that something you can easily send me?
Why don't you all continue the discussion while I'm sending it?
Okay.
So the other thing that we're doing in looking at that connection between the foundational areas is we're unpacking the vegetation analysis.
Thumb drive, Andy?
So we're looking at sort of the way that the managers are looking at different manifestations of drought, whether it's looking at this veg type or that veg type, and really trying to look at their perspectives of what resource base that they're looking at and look at how drought's affecting them. I think this issue of looking at the type of manager also is really going to be really important. Whether you're doing something related to conservation, how you actually view that across the landscape, or are you more targeted toward a particular species or a land use practice, and how that manifests itself. I think this type of approach, if we can expand it and get USDA on board to actually look at broader users and get some of their stakeholders involved, that we'll actually see sort of this more a better dimensions of how drought is being experienced and what perceptions different managers, different sectors are making those decisions, and what cues they're looking at in the way of their soil or hydrology or climate, and looking at what series of events, is it a 3-year drought like in dryland agriculture is really going to be the impact, or is it going to be a single, real severe drought? What's the time dimension of duration of drought that really impacts their decision making, and looking at those things. So I think this analysis will be helpful in sort of providing that sort of connection back to the other foundational areas.
Do you think there's an expectation, Shannon probably knows kind of, she's juggling slides. Is there an expectation of a follow-up? You have these interviews with people, they say, yeah, it's really important, I really want to learn more about climate, and thanks, well, we're going to publish our science papers. And
we hope to keep them in the loop. And, one of the things that, in the discussions from this morning with Joe and Andy is that, can we bring back additional information about the weather patterns and drought patterns under past conditions, and then also looking into the future with various scenarios, and then having follow-on interviews with them about if the 2000 drought occurred and it lasted for 3 years, what would you do? Those type of interview questions. I don't know.
If I can add on to that, so let me take it from a different perspective.
Sure.
Maybe this is really overly simplistic, but to analyze this, it really seems to me for people who need the same kind of on the same time. One up there at the ESA, there's a whole bunch of listing decisions. Is there any commonality to that set of decisions that they need all a suite of things? So by creating bundles, you can see who needs what, when, and at what. I mean, Dennis, you were talking about getting more deeply into the individual ones. Right. I'm thinking about using it to create bigger blocks of work that you can know everybody needs this on this time scale. If you can get that level of understanding of when things are going to happen, this is really takes you there.
So that was really cool work. A lot of this to mind. So if we were talking earlier about numerous drought manifest across the domain, I could just list some of those that Dennis had mentioned earlier. So here might be a list: reduce snowpack, reduce soil moisture in the ecologically active zone of the soil, reduce groundwater, increase extreme events, runoff, use surface water. So those might be some of the ways to go down. And then basically, I wonder about mapping those.
Who's that speaking? We're having a little trouble hearing, or maybe it's just me.
It's Andy Hansen. I'm close to the now.
Yeah, Andy, greetings. This is Bill Travis.
Hi. So here's just, I'm wondering if we could map across the domain where each of those forms of drought might be manifest.
Mm.
And then basically, and Joe is not here, through Joe's work, actually come up with metrics to quantify and map these forms of drought, and then basically use those places as an organizational framework for the impact work, and also as a way to perhaps, and Shannon, I'm wondering, to coordinate the interaction with the managers and the surveys, so that it could be that the reduced soil moisture part of the system might be where the grazing and vegetation issues that you mentioned are most manifest. And it could be the prairie pothole where surface water are influencing fish and wildlife refuges in particular.
Well, this provides a guidance to what adaptation options may come into play differentially across the region. So I really like this. Yeah.
And when it comes to the ecological impact, just for example, there's in the snowpack zone, that's all about subalpine tree species, and it's about wolverine. And then the runoff stuff where changes in snowpack are changing stream runoff, that's now irrigation and fisheries questions, engineering questions.
And insurance.
Insurance?
Well, let me just chime in, if you don't mind, this, Bill. You know, there are several experimental insurance systems being tried. USDA is involved in some, and you can get on the RMA site and you can actually sign up your own farm or ranch for a different type of index insurance. So there's these experiments and lots of theoretical room that would take on the indices that you're mentioning, Andy. For instance, you're essentially betting against or hedging against some indicator. Right now, a rancher might choose a particular prism cell or two, literally use the precip that's reported in there to identify their indemnification in the insurance. So I think there's a lot of interesting approaches to the indicators that you're mentioning across different sectors, not just agricultural producers, but the insurance world is insurance theory or approach is changing on this.
Yeah, that's really interesting. In terms of this area where soil moisture is manifest, the sorts of analyses that could be done there perhaps would be on vegetation chronology and primary productivity. Presumably, relative to grazing issues, either livestock or wildlife, climate-induced changes in chronology of huge interest to management sectors. And in the mountainous portion of the system, analysis of changes in forest composition would be important, as we talked about earlier. And carbon budget could be done there, and it could be done in grasslands as well, for example. And then, of course, there's water pothole, and then work on precipitation events and what that means for grasslands. I'm beginning, through your talk, to see how the different case studies, the different projects that I've done so far fall under this nice theme that I think your interviews with managers really help us start to see the geography of management issues, if you will.
Geography and technology.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like I said, in the database, you can learn to do geocoding, so we can code variables through the landscape. Yeah.
So, Bill, if I could follow up in the insurance comment, do you see examples of where insurance are driving management decisions or land use decisions in terms of what crops to plant or where to build homes or things?
There's not. We talk about that a lot with fires, you know, on land use, and Dennis and I have talked about this, and it's surprisingly little impact. But at least in the producers, the insurance is affecting their choices. Our own ag commissioner has suggested a kind of a bad effect. He says that producers that want to change practices in regards to new technologies or their sense of climate change actually get slowed down by the insurance tools being offered to them, because the actuarial approach to insurance wants to have, like if you want to grow a new crop, let's just make it simple. In southeast Colorado, you want to switch. You can't get it covered until lots of people have been doing it for a while, so that there's a base for calculating the premiums and the indemnifications. So in some circles, it's being seen as slowing adaptation, and in other ways it might speed it up. I'll just mention one more thing. One of the experimental range insurance programs in Utah and Wyoming, someone else on the call may know this better than I do, was using a vegetation index, remotely sensed, like a satellite sensed vegetation index, And the point of that is, or the PRISM data index rainfall, is that it's cheaper. No one has to go out and actually see whether you had bad range conditions on your ranch, like the old adjusters would for the crop insurance program. So they were using your idea of sensing either soil moisture or vegetation green up or lack thereof.
Right. And more generally, you know, there's this potential interaction between climate change and land use change, which becomes really interesting, you know, especially in the agriculture world. And I wonder if things like insurance are really the main vehicle by which those changes might be facilitated or inhibited.
Yeah, in theory, sure, and in practice, we keep seeing less than we'd expect. And the flood insurance program in the U.S., which has been in front of Congress now for the last 2 years, is an example of that. But in theory, yes.
And I guess that's interesting. And I was just talking to Volker Radnoff, who's been working on fire in the urban interface. And I guess they looked at homeowners whose homes were burned in fires.
Yeah.
Whether they rebuilt those homes or not. And he basically said everybody's rebuilding in the same place.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, yeah.
Regardless of insurance rate changes and all that.
Yeah, I know, and it's a little frustrating. I'll just end by saying that at least we're seeing experiments out there that, at least for drought, that take on new indicators and bring them into an insurance-like mechanism for lots of different actors. I think it'd be worth looking into, and we could at least look at the experiments with the index insurances.
Josh, are you there?
Yeah.
Can we talk about the discussion real quickly?
Sure. I can't quite hear you. I haven't been able to really hear anybody. Everybody's so distant.
So.
Plus, there's some interference in the background too.
Yeah. Is someone mute, or does someone need to mute? Is everybody muted who's not talking? Is there some interference? Thank you, whoever that was. So we've had discussions with this cross-CSC, Social Ecological Systems Integration Group, about having a conversation with the NOAA, RISA, and SARP folks about how we might share information and lessons learned, because while our constituencies are different, we have similar goals of informing decision-making and resource management with better climate understanding and understanding of climate in the context of complex social ecological systems. So there's been a discussion about having some kind of an initial conference call with the leads of NOAA, RISA, and SARP, and Dennis is going to be there and meet with some folks, and we talked about having a call with the larger groups. I guess the question is just how do we want to move forward with this?
You know, what might be useful is actually plan one of these, plan a from CSC call. You know, I think initially having some, smaller discussions with Adam, Nancy, Claudia, what have you, at NOAA, just kind of get a bit, a sense. So it's a small group of us will probably initiate a discussion with them and try to then organize maybe a joint call with some of the RISA folks or some of the NOAA folks and this working group and see what sort of synergies we can build. But Josh, I don't know if you've had other more substantive discussions at the NOAA meetings and stuff. Do you have any thoughts?
I mean, currently I've just sort of seen what NOAA is doing in terms of, you know, following up on the National Climate Assessment, that framework, and looking at the future of the RISAs. Very not dissimilar from the CSCs. I mean, the goal is to, you know, serve constituencies to better understand user needs and to make sure we have good stories about, you know, making an impact in terms of behavioral changes and decision making and things like that. The risk framework is, you know, pretty prevalent in what the RISAs are trying to do because of the National Assessment Framework. I kind of know what our RISA is doing on social science. I'm a little familiar with what the other RISAs are doing on social science, but I kind of wanted to get an overview from the program management. So my job was just trying to get us coordinated, given I know the folks pretty well in that office. So that was kind of the goal with this group, that we're both doing social science in the two centers, and just to sort of, since we have this coordinating group now, to join it together with the, sort of have a chance to interface. I mean, it just seems like, yeah, I think it's worth having the conversation, however that works.
Yeah, another action item, I think, is how things like the climate science centers and these, like the RISAs, actually fit into the executive order on preparedness and resilience. Because I think in many ways, the social ecological perspective needs to be articulated well in that whole federal response and how we actually do that. And because we work at a more contextual and regional scale that reaches into local communities, that we actually can do that. I have no idea whether, you know, how that's being brought in the overall CSC world, you know. But you know, in some of the discussions that we've had, because Fort Collins is part of the task force, you know, we're having some input through our own local discussions.
So, I mean, Shannon and my first goal was to make connection, and then just try to get somebody from that office to give a presentation during one of the SES group calls, just to sort of trade information. And then it turns out you're going to be there on the 13th of May, so it looks like you're going to try to meet with them in their office. And then Shannon and I were going to call in, but I'm not available at that particular time, so you guys could go ahead and meet with them, and then I could, you know, we could then have the call with them later with the larger group.
Yeah, the other thing that's emerging, the reason I'm there that week, is that the following day, Wednesday and Thursday, is the USDA discussion on climate information, stakeholder needs. Robin's going to be there.
Is that the hub question? USDA hub meeting?
Sort of related to the hub, yeah. And I think Adam's going to be there at that meeting as well.
Okay.
So I wanted to sort of see where they're coming from prior to that USDA workshop.
Sounds good to me.
So I guess you can meet with them, and I guess I can call in if necessary, and then we can just do a follow-up with the bigger group.
Yeah, then we could just for one of our cross-CSC calls, have, you know, Steve, we can schedule them to present what they're doing and stuff.
That sounds good. We've still got Anita and Duncan and Bob on the call from the other CSCs. Did any of you guys have anything you wanted to chime in on about anything we've talked about?
This is Bob. I don't have anything.
Okay.
Thank you.
Duncan?
Yeah, so from South Central Climate Science Center. No, nothing to chime in on, except just to, I guess, to point out that we're doing a lot of the same stuff that your guys are doing in terms of the mixed methods and social research, the interviews, and the ethnography work. And you know, it is drought related as well. And so, you know, I think we just need to sit down more face to face at some point, Shannon, with you guys, and see, because we're running into the same issues in terms of trying to meld some of that social sciences work with the more ecological and more sort of climate-driven, policy-driven stuff. So, I mean, that's just a big, nasty problem. So we're running into it as well.
Right. Yeah, that's a good suggestion to think about how we might meet as a group at some point in face-to-face.
On that score,
Robin's coming over to make a comment.
yes. One thing you might think about, this may be longer term, but we're in the very early stages of planning a real all CSC meeting, sort of a much bigger meeting, several hundred people, and this would be a really logical track to develop some discussions on and sort of have as a multi-presentation kind of theme. So I think there'll be an opportunity to really look over a set of material.
Cool.
Yeah, spring 2015 we're planning.
Spring 2015, he said.
Yeah, we're trying to, it'll take us that long.
So we should probably meet before that. Try at least.
Anybody else?
Anybody else have anything to say before we end this extended webinar / call? You might be muted.
Well, thanks then. No other comments?
Yeah, thanks everyone for joining, and obviously if you have any follow-up comments or questions, feel free to shoot an email, and have a great day.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye, everybody.